Hello everyone. In this class we are going to discuss one of the chapters in biology for class 9, which is diversity in living organisms. And for today's session we will specially focus on the 5 kingdom system of classification. So before discussing about the 5 kingdom system of classification, let us understand why it is important to classify living organisms. Okay? You must be aware of the fact that in this universe there exists a large number of living organisms. If I will tell you the actual number of living organisms, you will be quite surprised to know about that. So the different type of living organisms, the different species, okay, of living organisms that exist in the nature is to a tune of 7 million, okay, which is so high, okay, very high number. And we have identified approximately 1.7 million species so far, okay. So the number of species that exist is very high, and till date only 1.7 million of species have been identified. So the work is in progress. So scientists are continually working on identifying the new species. So then why it becomes so important to classify them? As you know that if it is 7 million species altogether, it would be difficult humanly, okay, to study each of the organism in a greater detail and understand about them. And hence it is imperative, it is important that we classify them into several subgroups, so they can be clubbed together, they can be studied together, analyzed together, then we can know about their relationships, their behaviors and their important characteristic feature, okay. And that is why classification of living organisms makes a huge sense, okay. Otherwise it is humanly impossible to go and study each and every living organism in a greater detail, okay. So what does classification means? So classification means the living organisms are classified into several subgroups basis their similarities and differences, okay. So if there are similar, some organisms are similar to each other, then they will be placed under a certain group, and they are different, they will be placed in another group. So that is what classification really means. And if you look at here, the sheer number of different living organisms, and insects as a kingdom, it accounts for the larger category of all the living organisms that exist in the universe. So why it is important, I have already told you. So for identifying them, making an evolutionary relationship, how different organisms are related to each other, interrelated to each other. So that is also, once we classify them, then only we can know that what are the relationships that exist between both of them, all of them, okay. And also for drug development, industrial application. For example, there are certain organisms which are producing certain kind of drugs, okay, or bioactive substances. So therefore it would be important to see whether there are any similar plants or animals, okay, are also, or microorganisms also producing the similar kind of bioactive substances, right. So because if one plant is producing a anti-cancer drug, okay, whether the families, okay, which are the, which the plants belongs to the same family also produce the same kind of drug or not. So it will be important to see that. So that is why they are important for drug discovery, industrial applications and agriculture. So that is why broadly biological classification is so much important to us, and we need to study that, okay. So let us look at how scientists have come about the classifying the living organisms. The earliest system of classification which was proposed by Carolus Linnaeus, okay, was the two kingdom system of classification. Very simple system of classification, but the way in which it has been classified during the time it has been done is one of the most important kind of classifications available during that time. Okay. So here the entire living organisms, okay. So if you know that, what are the different living organisms we have? So we have bacteria, we have fungi, we have algae, we have different protists as a plants and animals. Okay. So there exist these different kind of living organisms. Okay. But the way the classification, this classification was based on the fact that living organisms are classified as plants or they are classified as animals. And what was the criteria for this classification? The criteria that has been taken into consideration for classifying the living organisms is the presence of cell wall. Okay. And if you look at these different organisms, okay, for example, bacteria has a cell wall, fungi has a cell wall, and plants have a cell wall. So all of the organisms, like including bacteria, fungi, algae and plants, they are placed under the kingdom Plantae, okay, because all of them have cell wall, whereas animals and certain protista are placed under the kingdom Animalia. Okay. So the purely the classification in which the organisms have been, the criteria in which organisms have been classified, whether they have a cell wall or they do not have a cell wall. This system of classification was widely recognized for some time, till the point it was believed that, okay, till the point it was believed that there are certain flaws in this system of classification. There are certain drawbacks in this system of classification. What are the drawbacks? For example, as microscopic techniques and scientific techniques evolved, okay, or improved, people try to understand that the properties of a bacteria are very different from a property of fungi. The properties or the structural aspects of a fungi is very different from algae and that of the plant. So all the four different groups that are clubbed under the Plantae are very much different from each other. So then how can we place all of them together, right? If the properties, the structural aspects are very different from each other, so we cannot classify or put them in one particular kingdom. And that is why it requires further rework in terms of reclassifying them. If we look back, okay, what are the drawbacks? For example, the Plantae, it doesn't differentiate between unicellular organisms to that of the multicellular organisms. Unicellular kaun sa hai? So bacteria is unicellular, some algae are unicellular, okay, like Chlamydomonas is a unicellular algae. Okay. So bacteria is a unicellular, some algae are unicellular, whereas higher plants they are multicellular. So putting multicellular organism along with unicellular organisms doesn't make any sense at all. Hence this system of classification needs rework. Okay. So this is the first drawback. Unicellular and multicellular organisms are placed together. Okay. Let us look at what are the other drawbacks or demerits of this system of classification. Both prokaryotic and eukaryotic organisms are included under the same kingdom. Okay. What are prokaryotes? You must know that the bacteria are called as the prokaryotes. Pro means primitive, Karyon means nucleus. So, they carry a primitive form of nucleus. That means the nuclear content is not enclosed by a nuclear membrane. So, they do not have a defined nucleus, prokaryotes. Whereas eukaryotes have a defined nuclear membrane, they have a defined nucleus, everything. So, they have a true nucleus, eukaryotes, whereas they do not have a true nucleus or defined nucleus. So, putting them together, okay, also does not make any sense. Okay. So, this is also the second drawback of this system of classification. So, now let us look at the third point. Both photosynthetic organisms as well as non-photosynthetic organisms are placed under the same kingdom Plantae. For example, there are many bacteria which cannot make its own food. So, bacteria can make, there are some bacteria like cyanobacteria or blue-green algae, they can make their food. They are called as autotrophic organisms. There are some bacteria which cannot make their food. Okay. So, they are heterotrophic bacteria. Fungi is truly heterotrophic. Okay. They cannot make their own food at all. Okay. So, in such situations, putting fungi, bacteria and plants together, plants are autotrophic in nature. So, also is one of the demerits of this system of classification, and hence this system of classification got modified, okay, with time. Okay. So, there are different system of classifications came into picture. So, after 2 kingdom system of classification, 3 kingdom system of classification came into picture, then 4 kingdom system of classification came into picture. Finally, the system of classification which was widely accepted by most of the scientific community was the 5 kingdom system of classification. So, this is what is the 5 kingdom system of classification. This was proposed by R.H. Whitaker in 1969. Okay. So, let us look at the criteria in which R.H. Whitaker has proposed this 5 kingdom system of classification. If we look at here, the way the living organisms have been classified here is basis the demerits that we have already highlighted. Okay. One was cell type. You remember in the last slide that prokaryotes and eukaryotes are placed under the same kingdom. So, R.H. Whitaker taken a lot of emphasis or consideration classifying them separately. So, prokaryotes and eukaryotes are separate together. Okay. So, basis cell type organisms have been classified. Also basis the cell number. We looked at in the last slide that unicellular and multicellular organisms are placed together. So, efforts have been also taken into consideration for the fact that unicellular organisms and multicellular organisms to be placed separately. And also the mode of nutrition. In the last slide we saw that photosynthetic and non-photosynthetic organisms are placed together. Okay. So, efforts were also taken into the fact that this also to be considered while classifying the living organisms. So, let us look at it in a finer detail, okay, in a very minute detail of this one. So, when we took at the cell type, whether it is a prokaryotic cell or it is going to be a eukaryotic cell, so they are placed under 2 separate kingdoms altogether. So, broadly organisms basis the cell type can be differentiated as eukaryotes and prokaryotes. Okay. And prokaryotes are unicellular in nature. Okay. They are truly unicellular, and he placed them under a particular kingdom and named that as Monera. Okay. So, all Monera will include prokaryotic organisms, and these are truly unicellular organisms. Okay. So, now we have classified the prokaryotes into a separate group altogether. Okay. And what will this Monera group include? So, they will mostly include bacteria and some organisms similar to bacteria like mycoplasma. okay, in their properties, because both of them have prokaryotic organization, okay, that means they don't have a defined nucleus. So now let us look at eukaryotes. The eukaryotes means they have a true nucleus, they have a defined nucleus, but the organisms having defined nucleus can be unicellular also, like Chlamydomonas, diatoms, okay. So these are unicellular organisms, but they are eukaryote, okay. They can be multicellular also, like human being, higher plants. We are all eukaryotes, but in the same time we are multicellular also. So it was classified on different kingdoms, okay. So eukaryotes having unicellular component, okay, that means there are only of one cell, okay. So they are placed under a separate kingdom called as Protista. If we look at the examples of this, so like amoeba will come under this, Paramecium will come under this, okay. So then diatoms will come under this. So all these organisms will come under this, and many more, okay. The multicellular organisms are classified into three different subgroups. What are those? One is Plantae, containing the higher plants, the Animalia and the fungi. And this classification of the multicellular organisms into Plantae, Animalia and fungi was on the basis of their mode of nutrition. Just look at Plantae. What is their mode of nutrition? They are autotrophic. So they are autotrophs. Animals and fungi, both of them are non-chlorophyll bearing organisms. So they cannot make their own food, and if they cannot make their own food, so they would be heterotrophic, right? They are heterotrophs. But they are slightly different with respect to their mode of nutrition. Fungi is primarily saprophytic, okay, and they have a absorptive mode of nutrition. Absorptive mode means, for example, they will secrete enzyme outside the cell into the extracellular space, and what will happen? For example, this is a fungi cell and the food material is here. So they will secrete enzyme to the outside. This food material would be degraded into smaller pieces and then it will be reabsorbed. So this is called as absorptive mode of nutrition. Whereas us, okay, are human animals, okay, higher animals, they have ingestive mode of nutrition, okay. So they take the whole organism, they ingest it inside, okay. So basis that fungi and animals are placed under separate categories. So now, so we have Protista, Plantae, Animalia, fungi and Monera, and this includes all the 5 different kingdoms under the 5 kingdom system of classification, okay. Hope this is extremely clear to you, and the criteria on which the classification was laid out, okay. Now let us look at whether there was any modifications which were done afterwards on this particular approach of classifying the living organisms, okay. One of the modifications was done post this was done by Carl Woese in 1977. What he found that the kingdom Monera, under the kingdom Monera, there exists certain bacteria which have a diverse range of properties, okay. The structural aspects as well as their physiological aspects vary from each other, and therefore he placed the Monera into 2 separate kingdoms, okay. He classified Monera into 2 kingdoms like Archaebacteria and Eubacteria, okay. Eubacteria means true bacteria, Archae means old or primitive form of bacteria. And this archaea means primitive and bacteria. So, these are primitive form of bacteria, and these bacteria, they live in extreme environmental conditions, extreme environmental conditions, and that is why these bacteria are also called as extremophiles, extremophiles. Okay. And all other organisms, okay, were classified under the eukaryota. So, this is eukaryota, and eubacteria and archaebacteria. So, this is called as the three domains of life. Or the six kingdom system of classification. The six kingdom system of classification, what it does only, it helps to classify the bacteria into two separate groups. One is eubacteria and another is archaebacteria. Hope this class is helpful to you. Okay, we'll bring similar classes next time onwards also.